So thank you for coming, and thank you to Ben Woodard and Tony Yannick for coming here to do this event. We have a live stream happening right now and with Google Hangout, which is posted on the Facebook event page if you want to join in. Center for Research and Practice, thanks to Tony. And following the talk, we'll open up to some discussion and questions to people here and on the internet. So this event, Fictional Worlds, Possible Futures, Philo-Fiction, or Philo-Fiction as method, is a two-part event that explores the method of Conceptual non-philosophy and hyperspeculation as an experimental practice for conceptual possible. This talk is part one of the event, and tomorrow Shane Farrell and I from the Department of Art have a laboratory workshop at Hallwell's Contemporary Art Center at 6 p.m. And you can ask us to sign up. Shane or myself. Shane is down there. This event was inspired by the collaboration between Ben and Tony on Hyperstation and New Weird at the New Center for Research and Practice this past year, and from my wanting to organize an event that puts together different thinkers and practices as an exploration of methods, of thought practices, theory practices, conceptual creation, and the building of possible worlds is something to explore. In the Department of Media Study here at SUNY, our PhD program, which I'm a part of, is also. It's organized specifically around the engagement with the relationship of practice and theory, and we spend a lot of time talking about methods, about how, where, what, and the when of theory and of practice, where they intersect, or if that binary is appropriate. And as artists and theorists, the division of doing something and thinking about something has often been an issue in our discussions and debates over the last couple of years. In Francois Laurel's non-philosophy, he gives a method for the radicalization of theory and practice, where there can be no real difference between the two. He offers a non-philosophical procedure of turning philosophy into a deliberate chaos or chora of transcendental material, instead of an organized philosophical universe or cosmology. This procedure is called Philo-Fiction. With it, Laurel posits the equivalence of all philosophical positions and opens up a space for thought, experimentation, learning, and creation outside the philosophical image of those practices. From their collaboration on Hyperstation and the New Weird at the New Center, and similar to Laurel's method, Ben and Tony have looked across a collection of conceptual practices from fiction, hyperstation, philosophy, film, address. Ben received his PhD in theory and criticism from Western University. His dissertation was on the relation between space, motion, and naturalism in Schelling. He has published 2 monographs, Slime Dynamics, Generation and Mutation, and The Proof of Life, and On an Ungrounded Earth, Towards a New Geophilosophy by Plimpton. He's an instructor for the New Center, an associate of the Laboratory for Ontology, and is one of the philosophy organizers at PATH, the Performing Arts Forum at St. Germany, France. Tony is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Glasgow with an interest in visual culture, film philosophy, and media archaeology. His PhD explores the chronopoetics of the audiovisual, with special interest in critical practices within and against the political impasses used by today's so-called hegemony of the present. He has a master's in computer engineering, which focuses on artificial intelligence and mobile robotics, and an interdisciplinary MA in world literature and philosophy. Tony is also co-organizer of the New Center for Research and Practice and publisher at Triple Anderson, and previously was a production editor at the Duluth Audiovisual Journal. And lastly, if you don't know it, the New Center is a nonprofit institute that was organized by Mohammed Salimi, Jason Adams, and Tony. And it was built out of the idea to make the space of knowledge a laboratory for navigating links between thought and action, with the goal of constructing new forms of research and practice alongside existing disciplines and technologies. This past summer, they collaborated with eFlux during the conference, collaboration with eFlux in a couple of weeks to follow up super conversations. Here Ben is also going to speak, so if you're in New York, check it out. And that's it. I'll hand it over.
Thank you for the good introduction, Yvette. So thanks all of you for being here. I appreciate you coming out. Thanks to Yvette for organizing this. Everybody at the Department of Media and Arts collaborating, and Shane for helping with the workshop tomorrow. I'm Tony Yannick. This has been Woodard. We're going to try to do a collaborative sort of talk, and so we're going to be going back and forth. Feel free to interrupt if you need us to say something or recontextualize something if something doesn't make any sense. We will be dropping like neologisms probably a few times, so that if you need more explanation of these, just let us know, just interrupt us. So with that, we'll begin. Next talk's called What Could Have Been, Philo-Fiction as a Method, the Archive, and Conceptual Invention. So just a little background. She's with us in the fall of 2014 and in spring of 2015. Did separate seminars in Invention, beside Philo-Fiction and here in Invention fiction. First seminar on the genre of themes, working advertisers in different forms of literature, studies, annihilation, systems member, which we approach in the sessions semester. And the second one will be thinking about logical possibility, possible worlds, how they relate to fictional worlds, creating fiction, and then on top of that, reading some fictional works like mostly sci-fi works, Isaac Asimov, philosophers such as David Lewis. We also read Michael Sisko's Member again.
Yeah, talk about Afrofuturism.
Afrofuturism, yes. And vocative. So the first day yesterday was the first day we were in person together. We mostly work online, so this is great for us. So yeah, Ben, do you want to go over the general questions for the course?
Yeah, I mean, so some of the questions are very, very broad questions, but ones you kind of have to start with in talking about concepts as broad as possibility in fiction and world, is to look at how even more basic concepts, would say, relate. So this idea of basically what is the relationship between structure and material with something like fact and fiction operating in between those two things. Like how is it that fact and fiction kind of deploy between structure, whether it's narrative structure or logical structure, and material? Whether that material is various archives or actual matter. And so the kind of questions that come after this are, at what point and how do you articulate something like creation or invention or construction when you have this kind of problematic, when you have this relationship between structure and world, archive, fiction and fact, and all these things in play? What's the kind of starting point? So the reason we kind of focused on and the reason we kind of talk about hyperstition and also...
Sorry. That's somebody from the Hangout.
Wow.
So we will have people
perfectly
interrupting.
Cued.
Hi, Todd. I'm going to mute you for a second.
Perfectly timed. Hyperstition.
Okay.
So looking at sci-fi and weird and hyperstition is kind of these extreme cases of the fictional real or fiction world structure, looking at all these relationships in a kind of extreme test of them to see how they break down. So that's why the topics we've focused on, I think, are, alluring to us, I suppose.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Yeah. So a lot of these questions we're trying to relate to how it relates to contemporary theory, philosophy, and also how we can relate it to contemporary fiction. So we hope to elucidate some of the examples here in our talk. So the first part is going to be a brief introduction. We're going to try to introduce the concepts so we can then talk about them in more detail. But just a little bit of introduction. We have this sort of separation here. We have on one side logic and structure, and on the other side we have material, and in between we have fact in this diagram. So the questions here that we want to ask is, what are the relationship between structure and material? What determines what? So is there some direction here in this diagram? At what point, if ever, do they become independent? What Ben will discuss at the end of the talk is, in terms of creation and invention, how do we properly talk about this without falling into sort of like a naive structuralism, or what we say is over-the-top materialism, which basically over determines or over defines an entire world. And so, it's what we're finding is that it's not so much a straightforward dialectic between these two, and we'll play between fact and fiction as we go on in this talk. And yeah, so we're looking at these extreme forms, which hopefully will make more sense a little bit later. Is hyperstition, which is a neologism from the Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit. Philo-Fiction, which is most commonly attributed to Laurel, she introduced for us, and sci-fi, which deals with possible worlds of other extreme cases. And so this is for us a form of like experimentalism to sort of test out worlds that might be unthinkable, even but it's not necessarily a structure. It's perhaps like a general definitions as things that we discover, and this middle ground will become important more when we try to approach Laurel's concept at the end. So, moving on. So what's at stake, hopefully, to reiterate, to discuss Philo-Fiction as a method, a tension emerges between the archive and creation is itself internal to each form. In each form here, we're going to be discussing as possible, impossible, fictional, hyperstitional, ontological, actually, as well. So in terms of how its conceptual core relates to, so the particular form of fiction, in other words, for us, for each can only be demonstrated as a philosophical side. So this is a playful definition with Laurel's actual method of Philo-Fiction, which is the creation of concepts alongside the material. So we're sort of right now playing between our definition and Laurel's. So I believe here we're going to start defining some concepts, right? So yeah, so the concepts we're going to define is world, impossible, archive, fiction, hyperstition, invention, and Philo-Fiction. So the first is world. The world can be generally conceived as a state of affairs or a state of things. There are actual worlds, the world that we live in which we can reference. The empirical world is an actual world. There are fictional worlds, such as a movie, a film world, or a world that's created inside of a narrative, or a hypothetical world. But also, these relate also very closely to impossible and possible worlds. So, possible world, which we'll describe more. But the possible world is within the realm of logic, but does not come in communication with the actual world. It's something that we can think about that is possible logically, but it's something that we don't actually live in. Although the actual argued fictional because it's a cultural and social construct by theorists like Umberto Eco, Jacques Rancière, and Gilles Deleuze, but also the actual world, according to Dave Lewis, which Ben will get to, is one such possible world. It's the possible world in which we live in. So fictional worlds, are, by our definition that we've come up with, is more or less they're parasitic on the real world. There's an overlap, which I've been mentioning, between the fictional and the possible. And but the beauty of the fictional world is that it suggests some sort of free and open creation. sort of create what you want. However, while possible worlds are grounded in an imaginary, which is bounded, genre bounding, or will be and that a negative definition here of a contemporary theorist, Marcus Gabriel, who writes that there is no world. He'll argue that there is no such thing as the world when the world is defined as a maximally inclusive thing or a state of affairs or something like this. Do you want to go over our possible and impossible?
Yeah. Okay. Right, so in terms of impossible worlds, the idea is that they're worlds that are not logically coherent, or they might not even be conceivable. And so the difference, there's of course a difference here in terms of, whether the impossible is unthinkable or just, couldn't be because of some of the internal structure of the world. So the various, and some of them will say they're worlds in which, absolutely nothing in our world adheres there, not even logic, whereas, other people have more cautious and at the same, more cautious and less filled out ideas that they will test certain material things that seem impossible in these other worlds and say that world is impossible, but we don't know if its impossibility is determined by its structure or by sort of our experience of impossibility. So this kind of unknowability versus unthinkability is always at play. And so then, possible worlds are very much just about, a possible world is can be used to explain very trivial things that happen in our actual world. This idea that, a possible world can be the world in which you decided to wear a white shirt this morning is a possible world. Or it can, of course, be more radically, either philosophically or politically.
Okay. Next concept that we want to define here and that we will play with as we go is archive. I don't believe that they will be able to. I want to test. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I want to test to make sure that we can see. Yes, they can. Okay. Sometimes they can't see full screen, so it would be really bad. Okay. So, archive. So, archive, I'm going to start to define it by Jacques Derrida in Archive Fever in 1996. So, in this book and in Spectres of Marx, he'll talk about similar things in the archive. He'll relate it to the future anterior and the death drive. And he'll say archivization is a description of the temporal processes involved in remembering. It's about the relationship between truth and authority. Sort of similar to Foucault's definition in Archaeology of Knowledge. And so another is a memory that is haunted by the materialized supplement and the external archive. And one last quote by Derrida that I appreciate is, the given moment is never given. Let this given moment be given in just what is never given in advance. And here we it's a very convoluted quote from Derrida. It's much like a lot of the French, but here he's talking about a lot of the temporal. He's talking about the temporal processes between the past and the present that are quite important with the archive and how the archive is actualized, is past material actualized in the present and how it exists in the present. Some more definitions. If we want to think, I'm going to sort of give a few different outlooks of how the archives are perceived. We can consider it in relation to the empty present or the now. And in this relation, we see the past as a fixed entity. So we're on a fixed line, right? And the past is behind us. And it's an archive. The past is an archive in itself. A lot of data. We can think of like a lot of big data or any sort of sensing technology. They all use the past in order to act upon the present. So the past then is reduced to an object of knowledge, or in this case, a representation, some sort of form of representation of representing the world. This is a definition of archive from a professor at Goldsmiths about art practice and fiction. So it gathers together hitherto separate elements under a banner, a concept, a theme, a name, and so on. But crucially, it does not necessarily transform these elements. Indeed, ultimately, it offers nothing more than a product or a series of products. It's designed to meet the desire for knowledge, when the latter is understood as knowledge of the world as it is. So again, Simon is reiterating a lot what Foucault and Derrida is talking about. As it is, or the actual world. And finally, I think one is another strand of theorists who are the media archaeologists, who are very interested in the archive. And media archaeology is a method of construction of past and present, both through historical narrative and material interventions. So you have sort of the Foucauldian archaeology of hermeneutics and narrative, and then you have the German media theorists, or the cold empirical engineers, who are more about the material interventions, about thinking about the archive in its material form and how the archive is actually stored, which is important for digital today. And one very important media archaeologist is Wolfgang Ernst, and this is with a collaborative paper that he did with Harn Faraki, thinking about archives in terms of cinema, and how to create a digital archive in which we have machine vision. So how would machine vision catalog the history of cinema? But so when they're talking about remembered and what is archivable, by archiving what they believe should be remembered, they also determine what can be forgotten. So again, memory. And then just a summary of the archives. That again, it's an archive. We can think of it as prosthesis. Bernard Stiegler follows Derrida in this sense. It as in the form that it materializes memory. And the archive is a past that haunts the present, but also it's haunted by its own future. So how long can an archive be relevant, or how long can an archive survive? This is a huge question in digital archives right now because the temporal process of digital technologies. You think of the Twitter archive and how the Twitter has a short temporal scale, and then Twitters just disappear. Facebook comments just disappear recently. This will be a connection with ontology that I want to say. And then I'll pass it to Ben to answer this question on what is the relationship between archive and world. Well, do you want me to do it? That's good. Okay, so the relationship between archive and world, if we were to go back to this diagram, sorry, to go back slightly too much. If I went back to this fact, where is it? Horrible. Fuzzies are great. Huh? That was much quicker. Here. All right, so if we have this logic, structure, fact, material, in our sense, the relationship between archive and world here is that the archive is our material elements, and which you might consider the world being material, but we're gonna define the world as our logical or structural. So to review this diagram, if we wanted, we could replace logic structure with world, and we can replace material with archive. We can kind of throw these back and forth in our expanded definitions. I'm going to skip here, so this is much easier here.
Fiction.
Okay, so our definition fiction here. generically, fiction is the intervention or creation of prose that is non-factual. This is by all means a purely negative definition. We can also think of it as the boundary between. There's also another definition that's been popular in sci-fi or new weird trends, or even in contemporary thought, which is speculative fiction, which is involving constructing worlds or building worlds upon what we know and what could happen. So what is possible? This is generally what sci-fi. One of the things that the power of sci-fi politically does is it constructs possible worlds in which we can then experiment and test with them or think about them. And then there's a slightly off tangent but relevant definition that has multiple different versions, but it's fictionalism. And so this is the general argument that the conceptual functions like possible, they show us that concepts are useful forms of make-believe. So I go back to present. Yes, there. Okay, so the neologism, hyperstition. So it's one person that did a lot of work at their PhD defines it as an aesthetic response whereby cultural fictions are imagined as material changes. The research that Delphi was doing was involved with thinking about apocalypse in sci-fi and how this sort of materialized in sci-fi. So he was sort of seeing this as the imagination of these sort of apocalyptic narratives and how they have effect on the material world today. But this really comes from the CCRU, Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit, which was a group of thinkers, philosophers, artists, and the like. They were at Warwick University, Sadie Plant, Nick Land, Mark Fisher, Steve Goodman, Anna Greenspan.
Code 9, did you say? RG?
Yeah, Code 9.
Code 9, yeah. All right.
And many other people.
Luciano Parisi.
Yeah, Luciano Parisi. As many people, they met at Warwick for a really long time. They had different conferences. They were really interested in very weird forms of philosophy, inspired by the very Deleuzian philosophy in the 90s. So they came up with this concept called hyperstition, which is a form of, it's a mashup, right, of hype and superstition. So they defined it many times throughout the years. They ran a blog for 10 years, maybe 10 years, and where they all came on and made definitions. And so some of the definitions I'm pulling here. The general definition, the easiest way to think about it, is fictions that become real or fictions that make themselves real. It brings up a question for us of how epistemology crosses into ontology, or what breaks down the barrier between real and fictional. This is still a persistent problem in contemporary thought, so we're hoping that our investigation into the method of fiction can shed some light on this. But what does it really mean for fictions to become real? It's kind of a difficult thing, and we're going to return to this concept, and I'll try to bring it back. But to try to give a very short explanation is they were looking a lot into H.P. Lovecraft's work and Cthulhu, and they were inspired by how Cthulhu mythos were kind of a collective narrative, and how they were propagated without Lovecraft being there. They had no authorial intent. However, these things were sort of like making themselves known, and this world is starting to get built. Of course, now we're still inside of a fiction, real, and this is going to be a very specific temporal logic that they have. I guess the best way, and maybe you can help after this, is one concern is that in the present there are conditions that exist that are not activated in the present. This is one of the general beliefs, and these you can manipulate these material in such a way in which you can produce futures. So you can have possibilities. And one of their goals was to basically do this. They said it was a pragmatic skepticism or a constructive escape from integrated thinking. Religious dogma, law, so-called common sense, truth, fact. It's not a simple matter of true and false with hyperstitious systems, so they don't care really when they create these what they call hyperstitional carriers or fictions. They don't care whether they know they're false. The point is they're committing to it as a form of belief. So it's a form of commitment to a false thing in order to produce it and make it real, make it happen. And so it's not simply a passive quality in the sense. It was active for them. The situation is much closer to the phenomenon of hype than to religious belief. So that's a very big separation we need to do. Just because it's not real now doesn't mean it won't be real at some point in the future. And then once it's real, in a sense, it always has been. It's a very famous sort of like review in 1998 that's brought up again and again with hyperstition. So I know it's still very hazy, but we'll come back to it and hopefully have a better way of approaching it. So then, invention.
Yeah. So then the idea of invention and creation becomes very important, but it's also very difficult in order, since the relationship between like the material and the structure, and it's like Tony mentioned, it's not skew it as just a dialectic. And so the kind of question is, how do you get around having this kind of eventual model of change or invention that's kind of that it's about, whether it's the myth of the genius, whether it's kind of eureka moment, whether it's or even like someone like Badiou, this idea that novelty or certain accounts of change have to emerge from like a kind of radical exteriority on the one hand, and on the other hand you have at times a more kind of immanentist or Deleuzian account of the internality of change, the idea that change kind of arises and is almost always happening in some sense. And so there's often this tension between, the kind of the openness of the world, an idea of an open world allows for kind of radical change to come into it, but then that's sort of at the cost of the effect of the material or the archive, of its effects on change. Of course, being extreme in the other sense, creation or change is this kind of always occurring or kind of series of small concepts might not be correctly attuned to larger kinds of change, which aren't necessarily from an absolute outside, but might be outside of how that archive is formed. So there's this. So it's how do you have this kind of not too gradualist, not too radical notion of change that is also not merely dialectical. That's, I think, what.
Right. Yes, because Badiou's idea of creation, the event, the event, the capital E, I think like Badiou, I'm not 100% a scholar of Badiou, and Ben can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that the last radical change or the last event is May 68 for Badiou, and there has not been one since. Has there been one since? I think it's.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't think of one.
I think for Badiou, this is the event. This is the last time there was any sort of radical change, and this is the political movement of 1968, specifically in the French context, but we can think of it in Chicago and all over the world. Things were Argentina. Things were happening all over the world at this time. Deleuze's event is similar to this, except for that it's constantly happening and it's constantly regenerating. Novelty is happening all the time. And so we're going to take it slightly different and try to think of invention as a way of manipulating past or present conditions in order to produce perhaps not radically novel things, but new ways of being able to think of things or test things or heuristic functions for being able to, I don't know, create new beliefs in things that we might have forgotten, like a future, for instance. This is actually quite similar, I think. It's more on the side of Deleuze and Badiou, I would say, but maybe it would be different with you, with method of dramatization and whatnot. It's my little add-in to your invention. Okay. Sorry, this is very small. So we have Philo-Fiction here now. So Philo-Fiction is a concept that is brought up many, many times with French philosopher Francois Laruelle. And is Philo-Fiction, photo-fiction, it's just multiple ways of dealing with this concept. And the way we're going to sort of define it, which is not exactly the way he is, we would call it a self-referencing or looping method in relation to this Philo-Fiction. And his is a construction of a radical fiction, which he says is non-foundational, or hyper-speculation according to its material and not of its material. Again, this references how creation exists alongside, not an ontological creation of an entity. It's a creation alongside, it's conceptual creation of entities. So while we're trying to introduce and use this Philo-Fiction, we're going to try to expand it and look at it from many possible ways of many thinkers that are using a philo-fictional method. So I guess we're going to redefine this so as to not conflate, for instance, Nick Land and Francois Laruelle. And whereas philosophical texts have contained fictions, which we're going to say are thought experiments or logical illustrations, or they've been presented in purely fictional forms like movies or books, or we have examples here: Voltaire's Candide, various utopias, blah blah blah. Philo-fiction, strangeness of certain conceptual inventions by claiming they were found and that they already existed but present as past in a fictional manner that may be true. So this is going to have relation to a lot of the art methods that I will be looking at, and again with hyperstition, is that there's actually like a fictional creation of archival material in order to propagate a story in a pseudo-factual way. A really good example of this is Reza Negrestani's Cyclonopedia. If nobody's read that, it's a very interesting alternative history of the Middle East based on the, like, I don't know, it's like an animism of oil in a way. So, and there's many things, many hyperstitional or fictional archives that are created. I mean, there's a whole fictional history. There's an echo. We almost got it. Hi, Tom. I'm going to mute you. Thanks for being here. Tom McGlynn, everybody. All right. So this is sort of like we're trying to make a somewhat of a different relation to it and expand Philo-Fiction in sort of this way that will allow us to talk about hauntology, hyperstition, even what Eschen's looking at sci-fi and Afrofuturism, these things. So they often take on this. We're going to say that also that we want them. They also take on a collective life in a way. So this is again the Cthulhu mythos example that we gave. So to compare and contrast them, I guess there's a major temporal sneakiness of hyperstition. Is that it's this cunning method. Is that you're like trying to basically, in a way, install fictional things in order to propagate a future in a way. The way that they were doing it was that they would install hyperstitional carriers, and they would follow them through and try to see what futures may be created There are ways, I mean, they didn't like have like a set goal of a future and then say like, okay, we're going to launch this and then we're going to get to that goal. But there was more like an experimental method. So a concept used a lot is a Greek concept, matisse or cunning, of doing this sort of way. This also relates to like the form of sort of producing hype. But in Laruelle, he's sort of creating concepts alongside. He's more interested in doing justice to the real, whereas more like hyperstition or alternative histories are more interested maybe in the boundary between the real and the fictional, or the possible and impossible. So it's not really interested in the sort of temporal manipulation of the future. He's interested in sort of like abstraction or conceptual creation in the real, the now, the present. So yeah, this future-orientedness is what we sort of want to push forward in thinking about these methodologies. So so like again, the purpose of one of our courses is trying to develop this method, which right now we have no name for, which is why we have to define it alongside of Laruelle's Philo-Fiction, but of a way of thinking about these concepts of installing futures, creating futures, building worlds, testing worlds, experimenting with these things, and future-oriented fictional thinking, I guess, is the way we're trying to think about it. So that's, in a nutshell, the conceptual landscape of what we want to talk about. And we're going to now reapproach these in more detail and kind of give you, I'll get a little bit about these methodologies and a little bit of examples of certain thinkers that we've pulled out throughout the times before we make any sort of like conclusions. So Ben will talk about the worlds impossible and possible.
Okay, thanks. So this means going down a bit of a logical rabbit hole, but hopefully in the fun way. I won't throw like lots of symbols. In terms of structure or logic and worlds, is the basic question of what worlds are and sort of what and how logics function in a very, very broad conceptual sense. So guiding question is, are worlds structures, facts, or things that in turn could be collections or sets of structures, facts, or things? So you immediately have this kind of very generic concept of sort of how plastic or not is the world, and then how does that relate to what it is that it supposedly contains. And so, focusing on fiction and philo-fiction, because of their kind of extreme examples of the potential consequences of structure, are useful in kind of upsetting purely logical or semantic articulations of worlds, and as well as really pushing and seeing all the different variations of possibility and impossibility. So at the same time, I don't want to say that, but on the other hand, to say that the world is just more than structure, that the world always kind of escapes structure, is something that I think needs a little more work. It's the world is not just more than. It's not just more than this. It's about this sort of this strange asymmetrical dialectic we've been trying, kind of circling around and trying to discover. So David Lewis is often, analytic philosopher from Australia. His big thing was this idea of possible worlds. And so for him, a world was a maximally big. It was the most maximally big thing. So it's like the world is everything that ever was and that ever will be, and the actual world is that one that we happen to be located in. So like very broad term. So the world is just the most big thing and that we're in is the actual world. And so his reasoning for doing this is that in order to make sense and in order to justify modal statements about, could have happened, things like possibility, contingency, necessity, even in the very ways that we speak, when we talk about what could have happened, what may happen, what must happen, that those kinds of statements refer to worlds that actually exist. We're not there. We're not located in them, but they're possible worlds. So those worlds, but he thinks saying that those worlds have a being or really actually exist and not are just tools for him is necessary to use possibility. So the kind of famous comment is that when he came up with this theory, he received the incredulous stare. It's like there's a name for the response to David Lewis, which is kind of funny, especially for analytic philosophers. To go that far is pretty funny. So for him, so there's all these possible worlds out there, but worlds don't communicate with one another. It's very important to him that each have their own, actuality, and they cannot communicate. But he wants to also make the claim that, and this again, their use, is that they all have the same logical structure. So Lewis thinks that in all these possible worlds, that the basic logic has to be the same. He thinks like that can't be wrecked. And so, this is not something that other people necessarily agree with. And other people issued challenges to him, saying, why not just have worlds and possible worlds be this kind of ersatz model, or just these representations that are helpful? There are these models we make. Why do they have to actually be out there, especially if we can't communicate with them? But his claim is that there would be no way to logically articulate modal statements appropriately without the claims to their reality, to their possibility being actual. So it's very much like he thinks it's worth the cost of the incredulous stare and of creating all these worlds in order to say, when I say maybe, or this could possibly happen in this way, that it is more than a representation in a certain sense, that it has logical consequences and it has normative consequences. There's an ought that can be issued in terms of saying this might happen. So lots of people have reacted to this in various ways. So to talk about impossible worlds, which Lewis doesn't reject impossible worlds, but he doesn't see the point of them, which is kind of funny. Like, even that is too crazy for him. Right? Like, all these possible worlds, okay, but impossible worlds, why would we need those to give some kind of logical backing to the way we speak? And so Graham Priest, whom people might know, is one of these people who argues that everything that Lewis says about possible worlds can apply to impossible worlds. And he thinks impossible worlds are useful because he says, and this is where the fiction and where I think the connection to Philo-Fiction, some of the other things we've been talking about will come in, is that we can think and describe true contradictions. We can have a story, and Priest wrote a short story in which is based on him having to sort through the things of his friend after he's died, in which he finds a box that is and is not empty. And also in the story, someone leaves and does not leave a house. Somebody drives away and does not drive away. And the fact is that we can hold these in our head, and we can describe them, and that they can help us, even if only in a negative sense. They can outline certain kinds of thoughts and certain kinds of structures, and maybe even convince us that to say that there is a logic or even a predominant logic in any given. He wants to say, talking about impossibility, has a functional use. It attributes itself in a useful way to our everyday speech, not even only our speculative speech. So in one way this relates to fictionality and stories is Quentin Meillassoux did a lecture that was entered into a book where he talks about science fiction and extra science fiction. And he claims that most science fiction is just about extending what we know about science into the future, seeing like how far, very much in this possible kind of mode. What possibilities could occur over time in this particular way. Given the time for them to advance, what could the future be like? But he wants to claim that these extra, he calls them extra science fiction stories, where there could be stories in which even science no longer works. That things have changed so radically, that the laws of nature, or what we take to be the laws of nature, has shifted so radically that even any kind of experimental science would no longer work. One of the examples he gives of a story where electricity just disappears. And like, how would we deal with that world? And so, it relates in some ways to what Priest is saying. On the one hand, in that we can, there's different consequences for being able to fictionally articulate these seemingly impossible things, which tells us about the possible and the actual, in how we explore them and how the stories unfold. And the other possible claim in Meillassoux work and in Priest's is that the things we take to be impossible, if they're based on logical terms, we actually cannot be so sure that they are impossible, that certain changes cannot occur, because Priest thinks that even the thinkability of certain logical systems or of multiple kinds of logics and worlds would suggest to us that the idea of a logic, of a certain overdetermining kind of grounding logic, of the one that Lewis wants to say all worlds could share, that it must at least be weaker than we think it is. And so this, there's a series of other thinkers that then play on and kind of expand these different ideas of impossibility. This one theorist named Takesha Yagasawa talks about impossible worlds. He could talk about them as tools. He doesn't want to talk about their actuality or not. But he says that thinking impossibility allows us to rank and sort out impossibilities. And that should actually tell us where the line is, or to narrow the line between the possible and the impossible, which then allows us to actively advance and figure out, is the impossible actually impossible? So of course, a common example of this is he says, it's easier to imagine hell freezing over than it is to imagine a square circle. Right? The idea is that we can picture hell and we can picture it freezing. Okay. But like picturing a square circle or picturing an impossible object in any kind of full view, there's images of impossible objects, but of course you don't see all their sides. And he says that there's a difference there that allows us to say, why are these kind of narrative impossibilities different than seemingly logical ones? And there's another theorist named Daniel Nolan who talks about this in terms of which is a great phrase, the strangeness of impossibility condition. So it says that because of the feeling of strangeness we have with certain impossibilities, that also feeds into this ranking ability. Which of course begs the question, though, we're talking about worlds and impossibility. Impossibility is, what does it mean to say, what about our actual world makes certain things seem more or less impossible? Is it necessarily the logical structure, which we might not even know well? Or is there other factors which are fictional at work, in terms of worldviews and ideologies and these kinds of fictions that are very hard for us to see, can be interfering with what otherwise might be a discussion of the logical possibilities and logical impossibilities. Then another theorist named Edward Zalta. I don't know, it's funny, a lot of these impossible world people have names at the end of the alphabet. I don't know why that is, but I think it's kind of funny. Edward Zalta seems to construct a metaphysical theory of impossible worlds, and he says there are species of abstract objects. But at the same time, he doesn't want to say that there's no general logical structure to the world. He wants to say that at some point, we gain the ability to think about impossible objects. But he doesn't think we should be immediately able to encounter them. that the world shouldn't already have a potentially impossible structure. Because if it did, he thinks we couldn't ever learn anything, which is a really weird thought experiment. So if the world has a fundamentally not logical structure, he doesn't think we could ever get to the point to even talk about logic. Interesting claim. I don't know how I think about that yet. But, and then there's there's more extreme examples of how a possibility tracks. There's another theorist named Mark Jago who talks about possible worlds and impossible worlds as just being made of facts. So that it's not about the structure, it's about the thing that they're made of and the kind of internal coherency. So, and again, this points back to the status of fact and fiction as this kind of middle ground between material and logic, between world and archive. That they seem to be self-grounding. A fact is a fact because it's a fact. And a fiction is a fiction because it's a fiction. You know, it's about the way in which they're deployed, that they're generally defined. But one of the reasons why Jago wants to say impossibility and impossibility are about the relationship between facts is he wants to argue that negative facts are very instructive. So very much like ranking impossibilities can tell us something about possibility, Jago thinks negative facts can tell us something about how facts work. So this idea that when you have a negative fact, it doesn't merely create a non-existent thing. He thinks that negative facts allow you to see the world sort of in relief, as opposed to kind of constructing a world as you add entities to it. There's a different thought process which occurs, he argues, when you add a negative fact, it actually subtracts other things from the world. So this kind of different picturing process in the mind about logical structure, about impossibility and impossibility. So in sort of the question of what's possible based on what you have, it's instead by saying what's not there, but maybe you think about what's already there. So he kind of claims talking about non-existent creature in the room tells you something about the room. This is his kind of claim. And then Tristan Garcia, who some of you might know, and who was a student of Meillassoux, his theory of objects and trying to talk about generic objects, he relates to this similar notion of negative facts and saying that certain contradictions are easier to imagine than others. You know, we can say, again, for him, saying that a square circle is just a contradiction isn't enough, because you can say, well, a square circle is not a triangle. So again, he thinks even with what seem like bare contradictions, you can extract information about the place in which the domains in which those objects are. So he still thinks there's, you know, kind of positive use for impossibilities. Should I move on, or should we switch, or?
It's 8:02.
Yeah.
What time did you say?
I guess I can finish. Yeah.
Fictionalism. Skip quiet.
Yeah. So how this all kind of plays into and leads into what Tony will be talking about is that, you know, what this means for the kind of relationship between fictional worlds and actual worlds. You know, what does it mean for their kind of parasitism? The idea that fictional worlds are viewed as kind of parasitic on the actual world. Because the kind of question is, if fictional worlds are parasitic on the actual world, does that parasitism necessarily take the logic of the actual world with it, in insofar as it can't even identify it? You know, when we have a future world, we create entities that don't exist, and the reader or viewer of the film or whatever is asked to fill in the blanks. So that, again, this is along the lines of negative facts, kind of speculative fictions, ask you to construct the gaps over time, you know, logically and scientifically. So this sort of importing and exporting of possibilities and impossibilities from our world, from the actual world, into fictional worlds, and back again from fictional worlds to our worlds, gives us sort of inverse images and negative facts about what we think the limits of possibility and what the possibilities of impossibility are. And kind of one point we'll return to at the end is that there's a growing theory in some analytic philosophy it's called fictionalism, which traces out all the different variations of what does it mean to say that any statement, any kind of semantically, logically, or no matter what it is always functioning under an as-if logic. We take this to be the case. And it's like even this idea that kind of injection of speculation there, questions and complicates the sort of possibility spectrum in a useful way. And so one thing we're focusing on, and one thing that Tony will talk about, is how in the different Philo-Fictions we're looking at as how temporality becomes one of the ways of viewing that complication of fiction.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna reintroduce hyperstition to you, and then introduce what we think is like a similar concept of, which is ontology. These are both two ways of sort of the relation between fiction and temporality that are important to our work or research that we've been doing. And then we'll do a quick conclusion, then we'll be done. So thanks for bearing with us through this. So I just want to give a brief, I'm going to try to redefine hyperstition for you guys after we talk about this possible impossible, and I'm going to try to give some examples to make this make more sense, hopefully. So let's see. So Nick Land, who's one of the main people running the CCRU, in an interview with Maggie Roberts, he says that he defines hyperstition as such. Hyperstition is a positive feedback circuit, including culture as a component. It can be defined by the experimental technoscience of self-fulfilling prophecies. Superstitions are merely false beliefs, but hyperstition, by their very existence as ideas, function causally to bring about their own reality. Capitalist economics is extremely sensitive to hyperstition, where confidence acts as an effective tonic, and inversely. So the fictional idea of cyberspace contributed to influx of investment that rapidly converted it into a techno-social reality. So Nick Land is actually referencing one of the I guess classic examples of hyperstition, or something fictional that becomes real, is William Gibson's Burning Chrome, the novel Burning Chrome, 1982, I believe, is actually the first time that the word cyberspace is used. Before anybody has ever referenced it, and now it's a common term in reality, right, where we consider, right, the hangout. Everybody here in cyberspace hanging out with us in Buffalo. But this is one example. I mean, it's happened in the RAND Corporation in the 70s, or 60s and 70s during the first and second waves of cybernetics, of sort of like these they were fictionally inventing technologies that now are basically a reality now. It happens all over the place. I guess a cultural example that we like to use is a director. Who's a director? The Thing.
Carpenter.
Yeah, jeez. John Carpenter. Right. He does a film called The Mouth of Madness. I don't know if anybody's ever seen In the Mouth of Madness, but In the Mouth of Madness is a great movie. It's a fictional account of hyperstition working. So it's the basic plot of the story is that there's a horror writer, much like H.P. Lovecraft, who's out there, and there's this insurance fraud investigator who is hired to apparently find him to see if he's faking his death. This writer, and he's proficiently like putting out novel out in this film. And people are getting really addicted to it and actually falling into these weird psychotic, weird moods. And so when he goes to investigate into this town, he he finds a map through putting all of these novels together. He can find a map through the covers. And then this fictional town becomes real. He can actually visit it. And yeah, I won't ruin the rest of it, but the whole thing becomes this hyperstitional event where you can't tell whether or not he's a character in this guy's novel or if this guy's alive or what's happening in it. But it's a really good account of, it's a really good fictional or cultural account of how hyperstition can work. It is a form of fictionalism, which we have said, although it relies heavily on temporal logic, which we're trying to go about. So fictionalism, just to give a note, it maintains heavily the distinction between semantics or saying and commitment and belief. Hyperstition actually collapses these two, right? It's I'm saying false things and I'm openly believing in them. This is kind of like their form of belief. Another hangout person coming in or leaving. So this distinction is sort of collapsed, and so apologies. It's hard to do. We're new thing trying to do this multiple things, so it's actually going pretty well though. So the distinction is collapsed. We have this new form of belief. It's a commitment, right? A set of commitments. It's not propositional belief. It's not like a fact, and it's a purposeful or a sneaky or cunning way of obfuscating its own domain by sort of putting it or placing it in the past. So fiction here, if we can define it by this means, is a generator of belief. Mark Fisher actually talks about this in a blog when he's trying to think of how fiction functions and the relationship between fiction and capitalism, and I want to kind of do justice to this, so I have it out. So give me 1 second to pull it. So yeah, he's talking about. So he makes this hypothesis using Badiou, and he says. We're going to make a counterintuitive hypothesis, and he says only fictions are capable of generating belief. And he quotes Badiou saying the final belief must be in fiction. This is Badiou actually quoting Wallace Stevenson. So, and so he says again, the belief at stake is clearly not propositional, but an attitudinal belief. It's not a belief that a particular factual state of affairs it obtains or exists, but that belief is a set of commitments. Again, I've said this, but I just want to say that Mark Fisher's kind of like laying this out and kind of giving me the background for it. Why is this important? I think one can argue that capitalism is inherently fictional. It's an inherently fictional entity. It self-generates its own commodities. We can think of Marxist commodity structures and sort of dead labor and these sorts of things as ontological or hyperstitional things. And so this fiction is essential for Mark. I think he talks about it later on as well. But it's essential for counter-capitalist fictions to be produced. It's essential for us to be able to reinstate belief in some sort of alternative future, something post-capital or something alternative to the capitalist system. Just to cite the most overblown quote ever that's falsely attributed to Zizek or Jameson or Fisher or one of them. I don't know who would actually. I'm pretty sure Jameson said it first, but I'm not sure. But it's that we can easily imagine the end of the world before we can imagine the end of capitalism. We have no sense of a future outside of capitalism, and so this is a highly salient, I think, theoretical position since the fall of the Berlin Wall, probably, when Derrida writes Spectres of Marx, when communism has its fall, when communism proper has its fall, and there's no real alternatives to capitalism. This is like the sort of end of history, the failure, literally the failure that the failure that we no longer can even imagine a future. Bifo Berardi has another book on this, where he just says we should just withdraw from the world because it's the only way. I don't know. It's not a valid, and I would say you would also agree it's not a valid way of acting. So really the question is, like, how do we reinstate these sort of this like libidinal drive or this belief system in order to like produce a new future or a future or a viable future or imagine things that could be different than they are now in a real way? So this is sort of like what we're trying to extract from science fiction, which is sort of like a determination of like hyperbolizing the present or creating a circuit of the present, Deleuzian kind of term. These are just the various ways we're trying to look at fiction. Hyperstition is one way, as a cunning way of installing, but we can look at hauntology as a melancholic way of looking at failed futures, of reinvigorating these futures, so there's like archaeologies of futurity, which is a Kojo Eshun's sort of work, and he looks at Afrofuturism as a means of re-identifying failed futures or new lines of history. His work in the Autolith group, his films, if you've never seen an Autolith film, you should see some of his films. It's a collaborative. In London they make a bunch of films which are alternative history films, which are very much inspired by the Black Audio Film Collective, another group that does these sort of taking the past, manipulating the past in order to sort of reinvigorate these futures, whether they be melancholic or utopian or dystopian. These are artistic ways or artistic practices of using fictions. But how do you sort of like cross over into the political domain, or how do you cross over into like the domain of I don't know, the inability to imagine, or the inability to sort of think of something more than like the next 3 minutes, because that's, I mean, our time span's getting smaller and smaller, our future's getting smaller and smaller with the sense of immediacy. But yeah, so I guess this is just like sort of like what we're trying to figure out here. We're trying to figure out like what are these ways of generating these systems. And I think there's the Brassiere quote that would fit in there, maybe.
I mean, there's like one of the things Ray Brassiere has talked about, and he's talking about Prometheanism, or this kind of different ideas of the future, is when he talks, he talks about this idea of progress, and he says, he says, of course, you can't say that, and I think he's actually riffing off of Ballard when he does this, that he says there's a barbarity to progress. But he says it's so often used to completely cover over, and this relates to what you were saying in terms of Bifo, this idea that that the barbarity of progress covers over the barbarity of inaction, or this idea that saying that there becomes a kind of a safe not acting, that in a way always in the last instance seems to kind of win over. Mm-hmm. certain kinds of thinking. Certain kinds of thinking are disavowed about the future because of this caution.
But it's not even like the classic Beckett fail better, like act and fail better. I mean, Bifo is literally saying, and after the future, let's withdraw from the world. Let's recreate, like somehow
right,
it's a recreation of some local, I don't know, local like commune or something it's so impossible for him for his generation. That's the generation of progress, the generation of modernity, generation of the future. Now that it's gone, it's just like this mourning. So I mean, it's like you have this relationship between hype and nostalgia, which are both form the affective continuum, and that you can fall into. I don't know. You can fall into either one.
Yeah, I feel like even more dangerous things we have hype nostalgia. I feel like that's very much the kind of It's often kind of like dominant, like if like Facebook timeline, it's like hype nostalgia, like manifested, right? It's like everything is like, feel good about your past constantly.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, so it's even like this more like twisted version of it.
So is there a question?
Yeah, I think we're trying to conclude with a way of not doing conclusion. But, I mean, I think. Do you want to say like? Because we want to say one last thing about how this fits back into invention and Laruelle. That'd be 5 minutes, and then we'll be done. Okay. So. Then.
Want me to go? All right. Okay. So. Right, so why we're sort of, parasitizing or whatever, attaching ourselves to Laruelle and Philo-Fiction, as was already mentioned, this idea that, he sees philosophy as often trying to, kind of, it sort of creates the world that it claims to investigate, right? And it makes decisions about the world as opposed to trying to actually create with the world, to try to discover things about the world kind of alongside of it. And so, he thinks that Philo-Fiction and recognizing that this idea of world is not something that we're trying to attach thought to, but that thought happening in a world, in a way, actually, he says, kind of weakens or depotentializes philosophical sufficiency, this idea that philosophy is sufficient unto itself, or even that thinking is sufficient to itself, in order to liberate the power of invention. And so, inhabiting this sort of factual fiction space between logic and materials, between archives and worlds, doesn't just mean we can say anything or do anything, and that we can kind of just create for the sake of it. On the one hand, we can, because following someone like Laruelle, you kind of suspend a certain amount of limitations in order to just make an experiment. But at the same time, because that's not trying to latch onto a world, and if it fails or doesn't fail, you can say, oh, well, that was that. And the idea that because that action, whether it's this kind of, hype or nostalgia or manipulation, is a part of the world, that's never actually, it's about the consequences of the act, broadly construed, rather than its obtaining or not obtaining. And so, because of that, the question is, how do you, what is it that you need to kind of focus on in order to not just be creating in terms of creating against conditions or creating only because of certain constraints or conditions, and kind of pointing yourself at the actual world. And instead, it's about this kind of notion that from hyperstition and this kind of notion from, so it's just doing justice to the real in terms of what you're creating is in the world, and yet alongside of it, on the one hand, it actually makes it very hard to create, and doesn't it's easy, even though you can seemingly act in some sense of how thinking occurs. On the other hand, taking from hyperstition that any of these kinds of moves are best thought of in terms of relation to morality, this idea for hyperstition, and for other kinds of, the relation to fictionalism is that relating time that it's an act that's defining sort of potential future time, in the sense that in doing an experiment, never just mere experiment, take seriously the fact that the seemingly actual world is so filled with fictions that you see the fictions by trying to reinvent that.
They lost the sound.
Crap.
Okay. So you can't hear us? Can you hear us?
Thumbs up, somebody.
You can thumbs up, or you can unmute yourself and say hi, or say yes. Yes, but badly. Okay.
Well, he just messaged me like
Okay, you're fine. All right, so I'm going to post the question in the Hangout in a second. So I'm going to answer it first, and I'll let you know what the question is after. Sorry. All right, so fictional characters like Harry Potter. How do we distinguish the boundaries between them? Okay, so there's, yeah, obviously this does have real agency. One of the things that he was discussing with the impossibility is, and things of approaching things that are unthinkable or possible, is a way of experimenting, which is one of the things we were trying to do in this methodology. We're trying to sort of think about is how do we sort of build a heuristic function of things that are more or less closer to the actual world, or how we can or even how we can manipulate them, right? So we can test these things. We can test it. I mean, Harry Potter, the agency of Harry Potter might have a lot more at stake. I mean, it's also it could be in itself a hyperstition, no carrier. I mean, so it's a completely fictional thing, but we could believe in it. I don't know a lot about Harry Potter except for what you guys were talking about yesterday. But yeah, I want you to like reiterate this heuristic function, right?
Well, I mean, like the one thing that springs to mind is the different kinds of fictionalism and how they determine like how fictions work. Because if you say something is fictional, a lot of these fictionalist philosophers who do fictionalism argue that saying something may exist or does it's a fictional entity. What does that actually mean when you talk about it? Because it could mean it's something that you believe exists and you can describe it, or it's something that might be limited to certain domains, right? So we could say a fictional entity is real for kids, like a unicorn is real for kids or something. So but a lot of them kind of get away from the ontological question because it's about that's about kind of semantics and commitment. So you can talk about fictional things as long as you don't take it too far. Basic is a kind of basic notion. So it is as if logic. We talk about them as if they're real. We can describe what mythical entities look like or what Harry Potter does. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have ontological status in terms of like this kind of semantic account. But I think for us, it's a trickier question in terms of, because it's about, if everything is kind of taken as this kind of as if statement, then, I think the kind of ontological status question is almost, the kind of ontological status question is kind of foregrounded by the other kind of limitations that come in terms of, authority and genre and these other kind of boundaries. So even if we say, okay, fictional entities are real, they're still captured in certain ways that we might necessarily be in terms of the domains in which they're allowed to operate and who can say things about certain fictional entities and who can't. So it'd be like a difference between like fan fiction and actual fiction about a fictional character. Kind of has like almost ontological questions for the fictional character in a way that has more effect on how it's used than whether saying it's real or not real. I mean, it's kind of like dodging the question, maybe, but.
I mean, I actually hate this example, this specific example. This is the thing that sort of threw me off the edge of a lot of stuff that I was dealing with, which was other agencies to cartoon characters or to treat. But actually, as you're setting it up right here, it does raise, it's asked in a different way right here, which is kind of interesting. What do you do with the agency that the fictional character already has, whether or not we recognize it as having agency? And Harry Potter is a good example. Jesus is a dangerous one, but you might as well go there, right? Like, what do you do with something that goes from the space of, and I can even think of, say, in the world of the Luddites or something. Ned and Bud would be a perfect example. A fictional character created in order to have a, what's the word that they're calling, like a common name or a common name? The word he's using? I can't think of the guy that's writing about this a whole bunch. This is more for the series. But anyways, like anonymous, for instance, like something like that, where it isn't easily describable as an individual entity. It is fictional and it is simultaneously. That was just to make you approach it again with some of these questions. What do we do when that agency is more than just simply a cartoon character?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the kind of agency of fictional entities or the effect of fictional entities. I mean, yeah, of course, there's lots of extremes, like the whole like God told me to. I mean,
right.
It's kind of carte blanche in a certain sense. But so I mean, I think there's extreme cases that it's just a justification that has no ground, or they can, no one could make the claim, no, they didn't. We could collectively say, well, even if they did, that doesn't justify what you did, right, Son of Sam, or whatever. But I think when it gets tricky is when you kind of go one step further, where there's fictional entities taken as motivations, and it has to do with archives. And I think that's why the idea of manipulation is really important. Like, it's in the Bible kind of argument, or, different than fans in a structural sense, also different than fans arguing about what happened or, which character is a jerk or not or whatever. So it's just a form of collective interpretation. But when you dodge your sources and older archives, the collective power to agree upon what a fictional entity is actually maybe not telling you to do, but giving you justification to do, becomes, that becomes a really interesting question. Especially when you have, I'm trying to think like there was like the murder, like with the creepypasta thing,
Because now there's a second.
Oh, really? I didn't hear that. And so it doesn't like, yeah, it doesn't, it's like the authority of like fictional, not the authority, but the effect of fictional entities is there. So the question becomes, how do to me, it's you have to have you have to have a theory of, I think you have like a theory of archives. You have to have an idea of how archives lead to justification, which has to tell you about like what archives are legitimate for action. And it sounds like really rationalist, whatever, but I don't know what else to do in terms of having like collectivized decisions about what's okay and not. I mean, that's not really helpful, but I don't know what else. I don't know if Tony, you want to say something about that.
No, I think you actually did a really good job in response there. So I have nothing to add to that. I would reiterate. Yeah, go ahead. Question?
At the same time, though, you're arguing for this hyperstition of kind of placing things in historical archives that maybe don't represent necessarily a historical event in the way that general representational of these events that happened, and then creating or inventing, as you say, futures from that, which is precisely what we could say about saying that there were WMDs in Iraq or whatever, like that.
Mm-hmm.
They created a fiction in an archive and used that to create a future that maybe perhaps wouldn't have existed otherwise. So, I mean, and also what I wanted to talk about was this negative fact figure field relationship that sort of played out, right? And to me, it seems that that relationship can only exist if you know where the boundary is between the two, if there is contrast. Like, how can the negative fact reveal anything unless it is understood precisely as a negative fact?
It's often positive. It's posited as a negative fact. When you say it's a negative fact, you say it's formulated negatively, as opposed to a fact being as something being false.
So it needs to be. Can you give me an example of that?
Well, like Jago's example is he talks about the non-existent hippopotamus in the lake. It's like his idea.
You have to say the non-existent hippopotamus.
Right, that is, you have to say the non-existent, and like this is like, I mean, that's of course it sounds very silly, but like one of the things, I mean, it's an old form in terms of as a problem for logical argument. Like Quine talks about the non-existent fat man and the non-existent bald man in the doorway. And this idea that for him it's a problem of how do you he thinks having non-existent things just fills your mental archive with lots of junk that doesn't think has any function other than saying it's real. But of course, the question again isn't like, because we can state negative facts negatively, actually generate something that the fact doesn't in the same way. Like I was trying to say, it's a kind of relief motion. It's the action of stating it that way that displays the lake differently. And that's a silly example, but I mean, you can kind of see how it works I think it's used in certain political discourses quite often, but it's not. I mean, when you talk about there's no future, I mean, that has a very powerful negative function. And part of the reason we might use that in certain ways is because we can't quite say we want the future to be this, right? Or the future will be like this, or we hope the future is like this. When you state it in a negative fact, you're of course inviting different kinds of discussions to occur. Whether that's, I don't think that's sufficient, but I think it's kind of...
So it's more of a grammar than it is of a logic? I mean, I'm not quite sure.
Well, I mean, it depends on how closely you relate semantics and logic. But, for me, it's that, in part, what we're trying to talk about is this idea that why there's a logic-world relationship is that when you're making these kinds of claims, and this is why when you make certain claims, whether it's a negative fiction or you're creating fictional entities, the way in which it's said is, of course, very important, and the kinds of actions that you might be issuing or even like allowing for. So, I think it's a grammar, but it's also a world, because if there is no future, saying it in that way gives you a worldless future. So then, what does that mean about the world? So I think it's a logic, because I think that if you keep keeping that in mind, and affects the ways in which you go about speaking about that world in a non-negative sense. So it kind of creates a certain negative picture, which then creates a certain positive logic. That would be my claim. I mean, I think this stuff kind of happens all the time, but I think seeing it in that way does something.
It's less of the transformation of what that positive logic would have been if it was just stated positively, rather than adding towards that maybe space, or would it be positive or negative space? Added towards that space is different.
Yeah.
With the hyperstition as well, they try to separate from, like, they try to make a lot of separations by using, like, cybernetic principles or technological principles, and specifically he's talking about the propositional logic of the possible worlds. But in hyperstition, they want to separate from, like, human desire or any of these sorts of things. So they go either in that it can go. They even say it can go into great utopias or cataclysmic apocalypses, and we're basically, you see them through and you sort of track the process based on past things, or an ethics for hyperstition. Work in capitalism to do very negative things, like biopolitical. There's just like a lot of work in biopolitics. I think there's like Luciano Parisi and Steve Goodman are two people from this group, wrote this article in a collection called After Biopolitics, where they're discussing branding as a form of hyperstition, as a form of actually like creating a future that doesn't exist, that you're effectively have this relation to the past. And because it's this branding, you're actually creating this sort of future. So this is actually, it's like a way of, like, you can spin that and think of positively, how do you brand things for good movements or left movements or anti-capitalist movements or things like, I don't know. There's just like, so it definitely can go in both directions, and it can get dangerous. And there is no ethical system to hyperstition, which brings it into very dangerous territory.
Unless hyperstition, unless that logical paradigm has no other end other than to create capitalism. I mean, you could kind of argue that capitalism is itself one giant hyperstition.
Yep.
Right? And so if it is, then is hyperstition the way to go for making something else? Or is hyperstition what's just going to necessarily propagate it?
Yeah, but I liked what they said about the asymmetrical dialectic and having this sort of like strange way of getting around change coming out of not coming from a radical externality. So how do you do that?
What would be radical externality? What is external?
I mean, often capital is seen as a radical externality more and more, right? It's kind of like it's the real, or it's this thing that, and I mean, some of the hyperstition texts play with this idea, but to try to kind of explode it, to say that, like, it's like this force was like waiting for humans to come along and like gleefully, give it life, which has a kind of like sick truth to it in a way. But at the same time, and one of the reasons why I think Benedict...
I can't hear you talking to me.
They can't hear you?
No, so they can't hear all this, I can't...
Be part of it.
It's all muted.
What?
Are you talking to us?
No, sorry, I thought I was muted.
Okay.
Oops.
But I think one of the things why like Benedict Singleton's work is interesting in his Antoni Mentis Metis, and this idea of cunning, is that, this kind of assumption in a lot of critiques or kind of certain ideas about what means to use, and that there's a certain danger in inventing these fictions. But if certain invention of fictions into archives is about this kind of reliminalizing in terms of what Fisher's worried about, this idea of like giving life to some kind of strategy that isn't just either this kind of structural element to hype that doesn't necessarily lead to hype, right? It's like it doesn't lead to capitalist hype necessarily. And part of the reason why Singleton's work is interesting is he does his whole doctoral work, and the work he's done since is about the history of traps. So this idea of metis, which is this put alongside techne and other kind of basic kind of modes of acting and thinking in Greek philosophy, was that techne, this kind of sneakiness, which is always associated with certain animals in old Greek texts like squids and octopi, and that in this thinking that's about the setting of traps, right, of pretending to be weaker in order to, like, the idea of lures, the idea of this, was very quickly dismissed from the history of thought and just seen as, completely not cool. And the justification for it, at least I think in Plato, and I think in other texts as well, and it also appears really interestingly in a lot of Eastern texts, before, is this idea that it's a weapon of the weak, right? This idea so that we can't let this kind of thinking, into the hands of anybody, because because hype is so powerful. Because you can make, if you make shit up and deploy it really well, you can make a lot happen.
I mean,
Right. That's just
even in a Christian paradigm. That's how we talk about how we were kind of wooed into sin by the devil, like through a
Sure.
series of traps that is set for us.
Yeah.
Like C.S. Lewis and Screwtape Letters.
Mm.
It's all this this intricate trap to get somebody into hell.
I have another question from the internet, from Botnow. Okay, so the relation between world making and fictional genres and difference and repetition. Lewis said that every book of philosophy should be like science fiction because it explores the intersection of the known and the unknown and the intersection of knowledge and speculation. Do some genres hold greater potential for philo-fiction than others?
Yes. that's just yeah, it's a personal preference though for me. But like, I don't know. So no, I guess because I'm putting my own spin on it, and what's a good hyperstition, I guess, or something, or a good world building. But science fiction has always been notoriously known to be, it's to be like the way to possibility in a fantastic, not in a fantastic way. Fantasy is an escapism, right? While science fiction is like an approach to the present. This is perhaps people that are fantasy readers. I'm sorry if that's offensive for some people. But they're like, so for instance, the fantasy genre, I think, is world building like Tolkien.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Right, it's world building, but what does Reza even say about this? If we're talking specifically about hyperstition,
I think it seems like certain kinds of world building, certain kinds of genres seem more apt to world building, because they're. And I've read about this elsewhere. This idea that certain genres are less parasitic on the actual world than others. Yes. Like the thing I kind of I've mentioned, and this is really easily the case in a lot of dystopian fiction because it's zombie whatever, like zombie apocalypse is add zombies and shake, right? It's like you just add one fictional entity and see what would happen to the world. Whereas in certain kinds of science fiction or certain kinds of fantasy, there's a lot of, you have to make all the stuff. You can't just assume. You can take certain periods from our history and use that as material, but there's a lot of entities that have to be added. So it's a different approach to world building than say and basically it's all different relationships to the archive, to materials. A very obvious archive. Whereas when you're talking about some general notion of contemporary fiction or literature, what's the world, what's the world building going on there? You could argue it's mostly like it's a dramatic affective kind of world building. I don't
It's
know.
also an assumed indexical one, which we didn't mention, right?
Yeah.
The archive, the relation between fiction and archive is, usually in novels and these things, it's like sort of just an indexical relationship to the world. So it's just something taken for granted as the world. It's just the actual world, but there's no like changes in sense of world building. It's more about psychological. I don't know, like dealing with these things in the novels rather than actually building worlds. Fantasies, again, yeah, create worlds that are outside of our world, our actual world, most of the time, which is why I call it escapism. But they don't relate to the world. Whereas, like, science fiction is notoriously known to actually relate to this world and thinking differently about this world. I mean, especially since, like, I mean, they are out there. There are many things like extra science fiction, which we were talking about with Melisu. But I mean, a lot of the main science fiction writers, like since Gibson, post 2000, have been turning away from the future and looking at the near past, looking at the present, thinking differently.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a quote from Delaney about science fiction, which I think is really good. Samuel Delaney, which is, he says, it's just thinking about the world out there. And it's also thinking about how that world might be, and particularly important exercise for those of us who are oppressed. Because if they're going to change the world we live in, they and all of us have to be able to think about a world that works differently. I think this is like this is the political power of science fiction.
Yeah, I mean, there's a documentary with they're driving around in a car, like it's like a limo or something with Gibson. And he tells a story of when he received a fax from his friend about Michael Jackson's partner's in vitro fertilization. And he just wrote on the fax, "This makes your job harder." So it's like that, like the idea that science fiction that the future gets more and more difficult to imagine. Like, 'cause I think, he's done interviews saying, it's like so many sci-fi writers are just like given years, like, we can't do it anymore. Again, which makes dystopia easier.
Right.
Certain things will probably happen, and then life.
Bruce Sterling claims that it's a decade or so since 2000. It's a period in which, I mean, it's in a real way we can exist in like multiple time times at once. Like right now, we're probably multiple time zones over here. Bogno, with people from Amsterdam, all in one present time, like all exist. I mean, it's virtual, yes. So, but really, you can just like it's a problem with culture, and like Jameson thinks about with prestige, appropriation of these things. But like this atemporal moment is like why people are turning to I think why he's claiming science fiction is turning towards the present. It's also, Mark Fisher calls it non-time, like Marc Auger, his non-place. He calls it non-time. It's like a place outside, out of joint. So he relates it to ontology. I mean, everybody, it's a temporal issue that people are having at this point in time. Either it's imagining a future, or being obsessively nostalgic of the past, or completely cycling through or reappropriating things, so-called hipsters.
Okay, I think we're almost
Yeah.
at time, unless there's one more question. Otherwise,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll ask that a different.
No, it's fine.
You can ask.
I was just thinking about, because you were talking about archives manipulation and was it future or fiction? There was at one point you were talking about these two different things. My question was like, you're talking about the future and then there's the present and the past. Does the future go to the archive to then come back to the future? Is that possible? And what does the process of unlearning have to do with that? Because from my own practice, I think the process of unlearning is very often like not taught us in this future, past, or present?
Mhm.
And in the future, what does the process of learning look like from the basis of the archive, which is already manipulated or already does not come from that place? So, yeah, just that. I don't know if it's a question or a comment.
No, I mean, this is one thing we were discussing, which she brought up yesterday to him, which is which relates to this question of unlearning. And I mean, well, there's a I think there's a big issue with the archives currently, and it's being worked out with the digital archive, is how these things are going to be stored, how long they're going to be stored for, and whether or not this is going to be an immediate relation, and it's just going to be consistently written over. There's also problems with this in relation to the distinction between storage and memory. So is unlearning just erasing storage, or is it like a authoritative narrative of So that, I mean, so there's speculations, I think, in all of these in all of these senses. Perhaps unlearning is, I mean, I don't know. I can't really say for sure. I would say that one of the things that we're trying to think about is how to build experimental methods to deal with these issues like political ideologies, or to escape sort of like common sense, which is what like why we use Laurel's thing, because it's like a free suspension of sense. So but these forms have to be collective, so it has to be like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have an answer for this, but it's an interesting question, and I think there's a lot of people approaching it from what I can think of multiple ways.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like the temporal aspect in particular, I think what's interesting is that there's a lot of easy identifiable models of unlearning in a negative sense in terms of like science fiction, right? Like the dystopian one that's just like, so it's a trope, right? There'll be a bunch of like 8-year-olds in the post-nuclear desert worshiping like an old Macintosh or whatever, right? Like half the text has been erased.
Yep.
Google or something, right? So like that, I mean, that's just again and again and again. So that's this kind of dystopian negative sense of it, but then there's also the kind of not necessarily dystopian, or like, it could be a technological future where there's the negative unlearning in terms of like machines, or like we forget how to do basic things because everything's automated in a negative sense. Like, we don't have to move like all the fat cartoon people in WALL-E or something, like this kind of trope of or being like hooked up to a dream, a dream machine or something. So yeah, I mean, part of the question, almost as important as like, potentially useful manipulation of past archives. It's almost how do you have an appropriate meta archive? Because you have like, I mean, you have the loss of certain archives, but you have also the digitalization of certain archives, but then you have so many more archives. Even like archiving the archives becomes this like weird problem. And so, I mean, to me, that's very much, and that's why this kind of, I think that feeds into the asymmetrical dialectic as idea, because there's more stuff. This is a concept Hegel talked about, and the idea that as we discover more things and think about more things, those things get injected into what we're thinking about, and of course it spirals out of control. And like, this is history.
We've already reached the end.
So,
yeah. Talk about the way that, when I asked the question about ideology, you said there's a relationship between, but the like impossible world, looking at the impossible world in relation to the possible world, that connecting this idea of like fiction and ideology, that it isn't enough just to see it, but you have to break it.
right.
So like breaking it, I think it's related to like unlearning, and like, so how does like breaking
ideology in the way you can see genre constraints. So if you make a fiction or science fiction that reflects your present, but then you push aspects of the present to the extreme, then you sort of retroactively reveal certain, you can see ideology in a way you couldn't see it You know, not because it doesn't affect you all the time, of course it does, but it affects you in a way that you take it to be your world as such, or the structure as such, as opposed to being a, you know, more shitty possibility that's, you know, done well for itself.
Yeah, and then maybe a form of, maybe it's also maybe like a and maybe it's a tangent, but maybe one of the things is actually like a creation of new knowledges and new things as a form of unlearning and forgetting. You know, creating new things that make more sense or that people are more driven to, that are more effective. Of course, again, this is where we always end up in the problem, is that you need to have some sort of way of tracking these processes, obviously from past goals, then you can relate them and track how they're doing. And then this can run into a whole bunch of issues, of course, like, you know, you can lead them to their extremes and you get fascism, like who controls what's right, blah, 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 all this crap. But you know, I mean, we need these heuristic functions, or these ways of tracking these the ways of tracking these hijack functions, or these ways of imagining worlds or creating new worlds. And this is why I think like Black Audio Film Collectives, like creating new narratives out of, you know, old historical archives, or Autolith Group goes and looks at the history of stamps in like African colonies, and then they find that they're all made in New York, and they find this whole new history based on just like looking at visually at stamps, and they can recreate this whole like post-colonial history out of it. It's creating these new narratives. You end up unlearning the old ones, or in a way, things like that, or more reasonable, more real, I don't know, more reasonable, I guess is better, not more real, but more reasonable. I mean, when I was younger, I was taught that Columbus was amazing. He came over and he, like, you know, did everything. But I learned new knowledge that he actually enslaved the Indians, did not find gold, sends them back on the boat, they all die, you know, brings everybody, you know, it's a complete failure. This is like also a mode of unlearning, I think. So, but yeah. Sorry, every time I know you can ask questions later.
I think, yeah, we can go see if wants to come and talk.
Yay.
Oh yeah, does everybody go back over here? Here's a question I have here.
All right, thank you to those who stuck it out. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate it. And thanks to you guys online.
Bye.
Tom, we'll talk later.
Yeah, sure.
Hopefully now that you heard the talk, though, we can discuss New York more. See ya.